Okay, good evening everybody. On behalf of the Center for International Human Rights, I would like to welcome you to the event that we're holding tonight in celebration of the 65th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on mental health and justice, stigmatization, and the challenge of inclusion. I'm sure you all know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the foundational document of the modern era of human rights. It is a living and dynamic document which is continuously reinterpreted in line of changing circumstances. And although the document does not specifically address mental health issues, it does address health issues in general, and it has paved the way, of course, for a lot of other instruments, documents, resolutions that have focused more specifically on mental health issues. And what underscores, of course, this interest and concern about mental health is the very powerful message of inclusion and non-discrimination that guides the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mental health issues have been a major concern, but they have not received the attention that they deserve within the human rights discourse. Only in the last, I would say, about 20 to 25 years, we have started looking at health issues in general, and the concern about mental health is a more recent one, but it is a very pressing concern, because mental health is an indispensable component of well-being, and it remains a goal which is very distant for a lot of people throughout the world. The discriminatory among the challenges that people with mental health concerns face is stigmatization. The discriminatory treatment of people with mental illness severely restrict their access to health, as well as to the underlying determinants of health, and undermines their ability to reach their full potential as productive members of society. So, with that in mind, we very much hope that our event tonight, celebrating the spirit of the Universal Declaration, will address some of the main issues involved in the effort to advance a less discriminatory, more inclusive social order, where the aspiration of people with mental health concerns can be fully realized. And I'm very pleased that we have a distinguished group of people today to address some of these issues. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. One of our speakers is on his way, but I will introduce him, and hopefully he can join us very soon. We'll begin. Our first speaker is Shabnam Javdani. Did I pronounce it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Who is actually assistant professor at New York University, and is a recent recipient of NYU's Gabrielle Carras Research Award for her work on gender-specific pathways to violence and disruptive behavior disorders. Her research involves basic science examining the distinct pathways through which women and girls engage in violence, and considers the role of specific genes, risky and adapting environments, and traumatic experiences. Her research is also characterized by a social justice focus, with an emphasis on the development, implementation, and evaluation of mental health programming for young women involved in the juvenile justice system. Her interventions are currently being implemented at 5 sites within the Department of Juvenile Justice. And she is going to talk to us on Beyond the Medical Model, changing how we deliver services to promote inclusion and reduce mental health disparities. Then she will be followed by Hernan Carvente, who is a research assistant at the Vera Institute of Justice, where he is contributing to efforts to reform the secure placement system under the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. He is also a mentor for John Jay's Sophomore Leadership Program, and is a senior pursuing a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. He is also a member of New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group, and is the Northeast Regional Representative for the Coalition for Juvenile Justice's National Youth Committee. In May 2013, he was awarded the Spirit of Youth Award for his professional achievements, extraordinary service to others, and personal triumphs over great obstacles. And I very much hope that we'll have soon with us Senator Kevin Parker, who is in charge of a very diverse constituency in Brooklyn that is consisting of 318, correct? The number? Approximately? Okay. Yes, I didn't finish. 318,000 people in Flatbush, East Flatbush, Midwood, Didmas Park, Winston Terrace, Park Slope, and Kensington. Senator Parker has championed mental health equity. And last year, he successfully led the effort to prevent the closure of Kingsborough Psychiatric Center. He is the ranking member of the Senate Energy and Telecommunications Committee, Assistant Democratic Leader for Intergovernmental Affairs, and Chair of the Democratic Task Force on New Americans. And he's going to talk to us on the benefit of erasing stigma. So without further ado, I would like to thank you all for being again with us this evening, and the floor goes to Shabnam for her remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I have some presentation slides that I'd like to show to accompany my talk. And so I think I'm going to try to take this microphone with me, if I can. Can I? I don't usually perform with these microphones. So let me just bring it right up. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you. So the title of my talk is Beyond the Medical Model, Changing How We Deliver Services to Promote Inclusion and Reduce Disparities. And what I really want to focus on today is understanding how we can fundamentally reshape the way that we think about how we deliver mental health services in this country, and how the medical model has become one of the default ways that we go to when we think about delivering mental health services, but to really bring that model into question and pose one alternative model with some examples from my work in the juvenile justice system. So I will start by just defining the medical model. It's an approach to illness that aims to find treatments for diagnosed symptoms and disorders. Very straightforward, right? And it treats the human body as a complex mechanism. It's derived from medicine. And the term medical model was actually coined in 1971, both as a way to talk about its strengths and as a way to talk about some of its shortcomings. And we often use this model for treating mental health illnesses, but the question, a primary question to ask is this an effective framework, and for whom? And I'm going to basically argue today that it is not an effective framework for some of the populations that have been often excluded from receiving the best care or any care at all. And that it's really set up in conjunction with the current healthcare system in ways that systematically disenfranchise very vulnerable populations from being able to get access to the care that they need. And particularly, my work focuses on incarcerated or formerly incarcerated populations. So if we're going to rethink their framework, the question is, are there alternative models? And my answer to that is yes. There's one particularly promising alternative model among many. But I'm a clinical and community psychologist, and some of the best models that I have seen that prioritize rights and social justice come out of what is this community-based advocacy framework. And community-based advocacy is an approach to health that aims to change the context of the individual such that they have access to all resources to which they and all humans have a right. So safety, housing, education, mental health, physical health, access to childcare. All of these are seen as part of the complex web and system that promotes mental health within the community-based advocacy framework, okay? And so there are some very important distinctions between the medical model and the advocacy framework, and I'd like to highlight some of those distinctions here. So the medical model is oriented toward the concept of disease or pathology, right? And in so doing, there is a centrality placed on diagnosis, finding the diagnosis. What is the disease, right? How can we diagnose it? How accurate can we be that that diagnosis is the accurate one? Once the diagnosis is made or once the symptoms are identified, the focus is on reducing those symptoms, if not eliminating those symptoms, right? The doctor is seen as the expert within this approach, and the patient is needed to be compliant. So the patient is someone who cannot see inside their bodies and does not have the expertise of the doctor, and so the patient is either compliant or not compliant with what the doctor sort of orders. And therefore, the problem of illness, the problem of whether it's health or mental health, is located within the person. It's very much about finding where the pathology lies within the person. Okay? This is to be juxtaposed with community-based advocacy, where this framework focuses on the concept of resource distribution. So this is kind of like trying to find where the disease lies in the community, not in the person, right? What are the resources present? What is the access to those resources like? It centralizes rights as opposed to diagnoses. It centralizes the enhancement of strengths as opposed to the reduction of symptoms. The advocate is seen as a collaborator. The patient is actually seen as the expert. This is not my wording. This is actually part of the community advocacy framework. And therefore, the problem is located within the context in which the person resides, not within the person themselves. And you can see this is tied to the framework around the disease being located in an issue, in the problem of resource distribution or lack of access to resources. These latter points, where the problem is located and therefore how the problem is defined, I think are two key elements that distinguish community-based advocacy from the medical model. You can imagine that it has many implications to think about a problem being located, a pathology being located within you versus some trouble being located outside of you within your context. And of course, you interact with your context, so you're not a passive person. In fact, you are the expert in your own life and understanding sort of how the multiple needs that you have and the multiple goals that you have. So let me talk about some of the guiding frameworks of advocacy. It's a very simple model, actually. It's not very complicated. There are three guiding principles to advocacy, and those are that it be strengths-based, so it does not focus on symptom reduction. It focuses on enhancing existing strengths and creating new ones. It is youth or client-driven, and that means that the client sets the agenda and sets the goals for what's to be done in the intervention. And it is community-centered. There is no doctor's office. There is no community mental health center for you to come to. Your advocate comes to you wherever it is that you naturally are, in your schools, in your neighborhood, in your place of employment, in your home. It is very much about understanding your context and being part of your context. And without getting too specific, I just want to mention that advocacy has 4 phases. And these phases are overlapping, and this is going to simplify it a little bit, but just to elaborate a bit on the model, advocacy includes the assessment of an individual's needs and rights, the mobilization of resources to meet those needs and rights, monitoring of that mobilization to see whether those resources were actually effective or not, And finally, transferring advocacy skills to the youth, let's say, who are in the intervention, so that this whole process becomes transparent. Because remember, your advocate is your collaborator. No information is owned by them. So it's all about the transfer of that information to the client receiving the advocacy. Advocacy is structured in the following way. It's a 10 to 15 week intervention. That's it. It's individualized, usually using a paraprofessional model, usually advanced undergraduate or graduate students who are paired one-on-one with youth to be their advocates. It's fully community-based, as I mentioned. It focuses on access to resources, and it's very comprehensive. So each individual client receives 6 to 8 hours per week of attention and care within the advocacy model, but for 10 to 15 weeks. And it's free. The fact is that every single advocacy implementation has been able to be done free of charge to the clients receiving the advocacy, partly because it is intricately linked with a university partnership that uses the undergraduate and graduate training model in order to deliver the services. So it's quite amazing to deliver a comprehensive model that has 6 to 8 hours of care that doesn't meet in an office, and to do so in a way that is free of charge. So before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and give you the punchline. Advocacy is effective in lots of things, and it's effective specifically in actually reducing mental health symptoms, even though it does not have the explicit goal of symptom reduction. It has the explicit goal of strength enhancement. This evidence comes from two main areas. One is called adolescent diversion, which started in 1971 in the states of Illinois and Michigan and Missouri. And this was basically a project that had adolescents who would otherwise go into the juvenile justice system, and instead they were diverted from it and received youth-based advocacy. What we didn't have is experimental evidence to indicate whether or not this program positioned youth in a way that their outcomes would be better than not having received advocacy at all. But later studies, and this is the second model here, that used advocacy for survivors of intimate partner violence, many of whom have complex mental health needs within their families as well, did use a randomized controlled trial, the gold standard of experimental research, and found that after 10 weeks of advocacy, women who were experiencing intimate partner violence were safer, reported higher quality of life, and had sustained social support 2 years after receiving that 10-week advocacy intervention. And so what my team and I have done is adapted these advocacy models to our work with youth in the juvenile justice system through a program called NYC Roses, which stands for Resilience, Opportunity, Safety, Empowerment, and Strength. And we do this in the social context in which there is a rise in girls' crime and arrests, while there has not been the same pattern for boys and men. And we see here this rise is accounted for mainly by things like simple assaults. And there is a paucity of programming for girls involved in the juvenile justice system. For example, though girls comprise 1/3 of system-involved youth, girls' programming comprises only 1/20th of current models. And so we adapted advocacy in order to see whether this was a viable program for this population, and if so, was it effective in reducing mental health disparities, and was it a program that girls would be interested in, feel included in, and not feel stigmatized in participating in. And we found that when we did a study, our initial study had 52 adolescent girls from 3 cohorts referred by various sources, mostly through juvenile courts. They were about 15 years of age, about 3/4 African American, 21% white, 6% multiracial, and they had tremendously high legal risk. I just put some numbers up here for those of you who are interested, but on average, they'd been arrested about 3 times each by the age of 15. And so, without going into too much detail, just telling you a little bit about some of our research design, we looked to see whether over the course of the intervention, how girls fared in terms of their mental health symptoms, and as well as their satisfaction. And so what I will say is that of all of the girls that were in our program, 90% completed the intervention in full. 10 weeks, 8 hours. 90% of the girls. So that says something about not only the extent of satisfaction, but the fact that these girls felt and reported feeling also in qualitative interviews included and part of this program, in which they didn't just have an expert telling them they had such and such diagnosis and they had to do such and such thing to get rid of it. So 90% of the youth completed the evaluation, and it was a high fidelity implementation, meaning that this was true advocacy that was being conducted. I'm going to share some of our outcomes with you. This is a table of all of the outcomes that we assessed at either 2 or 3 points in time. Resilience, delinquency, physical violence, and sexual risk-taking, we assessed at 2 points in time to see if there was a change after girls received advocacy. And self-efficacy, internalizing mental health symptoms such as depression and anxiety, anger, and substance use, we assessed at all 3 points in time. Slightly boring. Or slightly exciting, depending on if you love analyses. We did 2 sets of repeated measures, multivariate analysis of variance. They were both significant at the overall model, allowing us to look and see where those differences lied, and we had sufficient power to do so, even though we had just a cohort of 50 girls. The reason for that, as you will see, was that the effect sizes for what we found were actually moderate to strong effects due to the intervention in reducing the mental health symptoms. So let me just show you, demonstrate, and also illustrate as a way to close with some quotes that girls indicated. So girls were more resilient after 10 weeks. This is illustrated by one youth who said, "Before I really didn't care about nothing, but now I care. I see I could do a lot more, and that I'm smart enough to reach my goals. I don't pay attention to the past. I just look forward to the future." This is a girl who was arrested for stabbing 3 of her peers at her school, and through advocacy was able to join a summer apprenticeship program that would then erase those felonies from her record, and she successfully completed that program. Girls also had a large reduction in physical violence, which was pleasantly shocking, because advocacy, we asked the girls, what are your goals? And none of them, not one of them, said, I'd like to be less violent. They had the goals that all teenagers have, right? They'd like jobs, they'd like to be able to, have some pocket money, they want education, they want less conflict at home, all of these kinds of things. But they showed a decrease in physical violence over time. One girl says, all I've been doing is try to stay out of trouble. It's hard because wherever I go, there's a fight. So I've been walking away from it because I don't want to go back to the detention center. This speaks to some of the skills inherent and learned in advocacy that the girl is referring to. Similarly, self-efficacy was increased over time. Girls said, in the past, if I had a problem at home, I ran away. This is a huge problem for girls involved in the juvenile justice system. Over 90% in some jurisdictions have their first arrests for running away from home. She continues, now I found out different ways to solve that problem and figure out if the solution works or not, and if it doesn't, cross it off and go to the next solution. So a very showing her capacity to be able to deal with problems using alternative solutions. Very pertinent to mental health, girls who were in the program showed a decrease in both depression and anxiety. One girl says, I used to not be able to even get dressed. My hair was falling out. I was stressing out. I couldn't eat. I couldn't go to sleep. but the view I had of me then is totally different now. I'm feeling like I can do everything on my own. Of course, she lists 4 of the key symptoms of depression there in her answer without even knowing that those would actually partially qualify her for a depression diagnosis. She's listing a decline in that. Similarly, girls reported decreases in anger, a decrease in having anger, and an increase in being able to control anger when they had anger. Saying, now every time I get upset or want to do something negative like put my hands on somebody, I always stop and thought about it. If I hit this girl, what is that going to solve? Nothing. Just demonstrating the ability to think ahead and to use some resources and some capacity to be able to control that anger. Girls' substance use, including binge drinking and marijuana use, also decreased, which is particularly important for girls who are involved in the juvenile justice system because they are involved in drug drops all the time, for example, and so if they test positive, that is one reason why they continue to go back into the system, and their recidivism rates are so high. So girls often have a goal of being able to basically stay off of drugs and alcohol, if only for the reason to complete their probation successfully. And we have demonstrated through other data that I won't be talking about today that is actually what is happening, that girls are being able to, that the recidivism rates of girls are much lower once they go through a community-based program such as advocacy. What's different about your life now? In the past, when I came home, I was normally high to deal with my problems, constantly failing drug tests, constantly being reincarcerated, put back on probation, failing drug tests, being reincarcerated, etc. And so I'll just end by saying that this community-based model of advocacy is effective in reducing risk behaviors, mental health symptoms, and in enhancing strengths. We would love this program to serve as an alternative to incarceration in New York City, or to serve as a program for new entry for girls who are exiting detention facilities. And also, of course, there are much, much broader implications regarding this that I hope to be able to discuss with you all and hear your thoughts on, and to ask if programs such as this are effective in reducing recidivism by over 50%. Why are they not more widespread? What are the barriers to doing so? And what are really some of the bureaucratic barriers, particularly to doing so, when you think, for example, that many insurance companies require for youth a diagnosis to be able to cover them under mental health, to cover their mental health needs, etc. So there are most definitely barriers to doing so, and I would be happy to talk more about them. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abnam.
Well, I unfortunately don't have a bunch of slides like those. I figured that my story in itself didn't require any slides, so that's why I didn't prepare anything. But I just want to start off, like I said, in the very beginning, with opening remarks. All of the things that I'm doing at this point in time were laid out, and where I am now is definitely not where I was, 5 years ago, which is not that far off in my life actually. I'm only 21 now. Now, growing up, just to put a face to all of these issues, and I know that a lot of this research was based on, females, women within, and young women within the system. I'm bringing the perspective of young men in the system from actually having been in the juvenile justice system. But before I go into, the experience of having been in the facility, I could start off, like I said, by just elaborating on my childhood experience and essentially putting my life into the perspective of mental health, things that I never looked upon as being a mental health issue, but essentially having gone through certain things exposed me to certain issues and other stigmatization in the community that eventually led me to going, and actually committing an offense, joining a gang, etc. I honestly, I always say this in public that I pretty much fit the typical stereotype of the young person, who's kind of at risk, causing problems at school, not respectful of his parents, outside in the street doing the wrong things. I took it to another level with my gang affiliation and the things that I did in the community. But I essentially started like any young person did, growing up in a two-parent household. I had both my mother and my father. For a period of time, I actually didn't live here in the U.S. I lived in Mexico. And during that time, I noticed that my family in general had a lot of problems. To this day, we're very disconnected in general. My father, the more or less everybody that's male in my family, including my father, had a lot of alcohol issues. Um, and progressively, I kind of just went ahead and followed in his footsteps in the future. Out of the mentality that at one point, if I drank the bottles in the house, he would not be able to drink. And that was just that mentality, in terms of, wanting to be like my father at the same time because he did that. I really didn't know a lot of the things that I was doing at that point in time. I was very young. First drink I ever had was probably when I was 8 years old, which is pretty young in terms of, just psychologically how that affects you. The alcohol itself, the first time I drank just for the purpose of not allowing my father to drink. Came home, threw up. My mom didn't know what was going on, but both of them, like I said, were never up to date with what was going on with me, more or less because they always worked. But in general, the alcohol problem that my father had led to my mother suffering domestic violence and myself as well. My father used to come home almost literally every other week, or every week in general, drunk. And when he came home drunk, it wasn't a matter of, coming home and just coming to sleep. He would come, bang on things, beat on my mother just because she didn't cook something or she went to sleep instead of waiting for him. And me, I just kind of got caught in the crossfire of a lot of that. As a result of that, though, watching that violence, it affected me psychologically. And I didn't notice that, and up until, like I said, now looking back at my life, that I developed a lot of anger issues because of that. I never actually expressed myself to anyone. I really held a lot of those emotions in. And instead of confiding with my mother, a lot of the discussion was never on, what was going on at home. It was more or less, how's school. And most of the time, they never kept up to date with my school, only because, like I said, both of them worked. But the anger was present. It was just kind of like bottling up more and more. And like I said, at a very early stage in my life, I consumed alcohol, which essentially made that even more difficult for me to manage as time went on. That feeling of not being able to communicate with my mother or my father really made it, hard for me to deal with any of these issues. It made me feel alone. It made me feel disturbed to a certain degree in terms of, not knowing who to go to for any kind of feedback, any counseling, not even a pat on the back for having done well at school. Because I essentially started off doing very well in school, even though my parents did not have the academic background. Both of them were essentially immigrants to this country and don't have, a strong handle on the English language. I basically educated myself in the very beginning. Welcome Center, just allowed you to get situated. So in general, I brought a lot of these issues onto out later on in growing up, only because I allowed people to, kind of get close to me, but I allowed the wrong people to get close to me. I ended up exerting all of that violence, a lot of these things that I had developed through throughout the course of my life, having bottled those things up through joining a gang. I didn't feel attached in any way, shape, or form to my parents. I really didn't feel like I belonged with my family in any way. Like I said, I barely spent any time with them. Most of the time I was outside doing whatever I wanted to do. And they would never know because I usually just hit all those reports saying, your son missed so-and-so dates, or all those phone calls weren't going to my house. They were going to my phone. Typical thing for a young person at that age. But it led me, like I said, to going through other more bigger issues in terms of having joined the gang at one point. And I've been asked several times, why did you join the gang? Out of all the things that you could have been doing out there, why join the gang? And my first response when I started talking about my own personal life was always, I don't know, peer pressure. All my friends were part of that. And then if you go down, more deep inside into the issue, it wasn't really a sense of all peer pressure. It was more or less belonging somewhere. I didn't belong anywhere at home. That's how I felt. I didn't, feel kind of included into my culture in any way. I was very distant from it. And I needed somewhere to go to. And that sense of belonging came from joining this gang that I was a part of. I joined the gang at age 13. And before that, I was in little groups here and there, but none of them were violent in any sense. They were more or less just like childhood graffiti, things like that. It wasn't really violent. The violence, like I said, I guess really pulled me to the later gang, only because I felt that there was a need for me to protect my mother in a way. And the only way I saw, which was, like I said, very negative, was basically joining this gang and getting a status where I could literally threaten my father to say, if you touch my mother, something's going to happen to you. But that was a backwards mentality in terms of the way I wanted to address the problem wasn't the best way, and it wasn't healthy in any way. During that point of time, I also had who's currently right now the mother of my child. I have a 5-year-old daughter. During that time, I was also in that relationship, and it became very unstable because I started basically acting out the same things that my father did. I was drinking myself, and I was, again, putting the mother of my child on basically through the whole issue of domestic violence myself at a very young age. So I really, all I did at that point was shadow everything that my father had done to me and to my mother. And I thought it was okay. I didn't really think about the fact that it was hurting her or hurting myself. Or for that matter, that it was hurting my parents too, because I always got yelled at for a lot of my activities, but it was never addressed in the most appropriate or most healthy way. It was more or less, you just kind of hit me or go after me or kick me out of the house, and that was the end of it. And a lot of that, like I said, contributed to me going into the community and doing more of these actions, more and more aggressively after a period of time. And a lot of the problems that I had, like I said, just in terms of a lot of the problems that I experienced with my family, eventually at one point I actually felt, had the thoughts of suicide. It's kind of uncomfortable for me to say that in public, but it really did push me at one point to want to kill myself. Even though, like I said, I had supposable friends in the gang and everything, I still didn't feel like I was being a part of something positive. In mentality, I really didn't want to be a part of the gang, but it was the only place where I felt like someone cared, or I had a sense of family structure in place. And there's a lot of people who can argue and say, well, other people that join, other clubs in school or things like that. At that point in time, I didn't have that level of resiliency that other young people might have at a younger stage in life. So from having allowed myself to go through that, I ended up joining, like I said, this gang and be doing all these activities. And at one point I was ordered to shoot a rival gang member in retaliation for having killed a gang member years back. I ended up shooting a rival gang member 3 times. And during that period of time, I didn't see nothing wrong with it. I really just saw it as a moment for me to get my status up, really just wanting to prove to everyone that I wasn't afraid anymore, really just kind of coming out of that shell of, being afraid and feeling angry inside. It was just kind of expressing that anger in the most violent way. As a result of those actions, I ended up being processed through the Queens criminal court, and then eventually bumped up to Supreme Court for the crime of attempted murder. And then in October of 2008, I was charged and convicted of attempted murder in the 2nd degree, and sentenced to 2 to 6 years to a maximum secure juvenile facility in New York State. When I entered that facility, for me, it had been the first time that I had ever been away from my family. It had been the first time that I've ever been, like I said, kind of stripped away from the problems at home. And it really offered me a small period of a window just to evaluate myself, where I had been up until that point. During that first year, I ended up on suicide watch in the facility because I really didn't, it was a shock to me having been away from my family. And there was a few discussions and arguments that had happened during that time that really pushed me in that point in time to like, kind of like snap in the facility. It wasn't that I tried to kill myself. It was more or less me kind of like overreacting to the fact that I don't know where I'm headed. You know, this was the first time in general that my family actually started talking to me in a more positive way, having been in the system, just because they felt that there was their responsibility to do so, and because they felt that it was their fault that I went in there. But my actions still were not favorable to them in terms of I didn't want to talk to them. I was just very antisocial with them. And because of those things, I ended up, like I said, just kind of like bugging out one time in my cell. And the staff there literally restrained me in my cell rather than speak to me, put me down to calm me down. And that was, you know, I didn't think about it back then. Thinking about it now, that was not the proper way to, you know, address my problems. You kind of just restrain me as opposed to try to talk it out with me. And these are a lot of things that I experienced while I was in the system. A lot of my peers eventually had issues with mental health. A lot of them were on medication, which to me was surprising. And at one point I was offered medication by the mental health counselor at the facility. The reason being was because he said that I had some ADHD problems, overly hyper, very reactive, very aggressive, and he felt that the medication called Seroquel would calm me down. It was an antidepressant, and that it would help me to a certain extent lower my mood so that I was in a calm for most of the time. I mean, I watched a lot of my peers. Those drugs in itself really weren't helping them in any way. You would see them throughout the mornings very tired, lazy, and then you expect them in the classroom setting to be concentrated on the work when half of them are on medication. That wasn't the most ideal way to address a problem. And then at night, you give them a higher dosage of that same medication to put them to sleep. And when I saw all of that, I told the mental health counselor, no, you're not gonna, put me into, drugs, because that's all they are. They're not medication, they're just drugs. You're drugging me to just keep me calm and keep me, from being a problem in the facility, and I'm not having that. And I'm thankful that I made that decision, because a lot of my peers took the medicine even though they didn't need it. And during that time, I felt that I didn't need it only because I didn't want to be like most of my peers who, there was a line every single day, every single night when that med card came through. The staff would jokingly say, come on, go get your Skittles. And you would have 15 people on that unit. Out of the 15 people, you would have 13 going up to get meds. And from those 13, at least 7 of them were getting Seroquel at large quantities. And some of them had enough of it to the point where some of them saved it in their mouth and passed it on to another peer so that they had a higher dosage if they didn't have that. A lot of them used it for substance abuse purposes, in terms of they keep that medicine, they fight the urge to go to sleep, they fight the medication, and it gives you a sense of high. You feel high for that period of time. And that was, like I said, used in the system in a very negative way. After a while, staff figured it out, and they started trying to crush the pills into applesauce to get the young people so that they couldn't give it to anyone else. But fragments of it would still be left, and they would save it on the sides of their mouth and still pass it on. So it wasn't a preventative way to go about not having everyone else take that same medication and really damaging them psychologically. But one of the things that in terms of the the state in which the facility was, there weren't a lot of services at that point in time that offered some kind of advocacy, or something to engage the youth, which I felt was more needed. I was unfortunate enough to participate in the GED program, go into the college program, and have that sense of having someone actually care about me in the facility. I know once I met the people in the college program, it changed my perspective in terms of who I was before and who I want to be now. It made me really think about whether or not I wanted to do the same thing that all of my peers were doing within the units, which was for the most part either joining a gang or acting negatively or acting out just for the heck of it, because there was nothing to do in the facility. And that's why right now, in terms of the work that I'm doing, in terms of reforming the system, those are a lot of the things that I contribute to, because I know that there is a lot of idle time within the facilities, time that people can, act out and do a lot of things, and then all of a sudden, because of those actions, are diagnosed with ADHD problems. But it's not because, like I said, it's not based off of their actual diagnosis. It's just because of the way that they're acting with with the general population that's there, and everybody doing the same thing automatically makes them a target for getting medication. And I don't want to say that this is accurate, but at one point, some of the research that I was reading up on, and a lot of the things from the Office of Children and Family Services, basically that there's more money that goes into a young person individually if they're on medication. And that for me really was surprising in terms of knowing that a young person who's on medication, the state would have gotten more money to help them and offer them more services. But where that money went, I have no idea. Because like I said, programming in the facilities was at minimal at best during that time, and there's progress going on right now to make that better. And just in general, the way I managed to change my life around was through, to a certain extent, advocacy and people actually, excuse me, actually taking the time to look at me not as a young juvenile offender, a violent gangbanger, or anything to that extent. It really it took one person to turn my life around, and that one person was the professor from the college program. He motivated me in the sense that he didn't look at me anymore as, he didn't label me anymore for any of the things that I was labeled at that point in time, in terms of being at-risk youth, being out of control. A lot of these labels that I had, even into the certain extent of being a juvenile offender, that label in itself carries a lot of weight in a negative context. And he never called me that. He always called me, Hernan, or Carvente, but he always addressed me by my name rather than addressing me by any other label that I had been given because of my conviction or any of the other problems that I had experienced. Those labels in themselves had pulled me down for a long period of time, and when this one professor decides to come and talk to me as a person and label me by my name, the name that I've been given by my mother and father, and he starts pointing things out to me that I never actually took into consideration. The fact that a lot of the problems at home were a result of me not talking about them, that I needed to talk about them, that I needed to release them to a certain extent with someone. And I told them I'm not willing to go to the mental health counselor because all they're going to do is put me on meds. I always told them that. So it goes down to you don't even need to put a young person through the mental health counselor. It really just takes that one person, and this one professor really fit that role. Because he listened to my problems, and no longer that I have to, think that I had mental health issues or any kind of, anger issues, because I let a lot of that out just through conversations and just normal dialogue with, this professor. And he essentially pulled me from the system through that and through education. I did not know a lot of the things that I was doing were harming myself or my family up until I ended up taking more college courses, actually advancing myself academically. And then I took a huge respect to education and realized that that was my way out in terms of a lot of the problems that I was getting myself into. So which is why I walked out of that facility with 54 college credits. And to be honest, I went through the whole problem of having dropped out of that program 3 times. The first time, he literally went to my cell and dragged me back into the college program, saying that I had to stop, being scared of success, because that's what he pretty much said, that I was scared of success. And I continuously argued against him that that wasn't the case, that I wasn't afraid of it, but in reality, I was. I didn't know what it was going to be like to, do a lot of the things that I aiming to do in terms of being a college student, contributing positively to the college program, because I became a leader in the college program. The second time I dropped was simply because I had a lot of problems going on at home that were out of my reach, and again, that sense, that I needed to do something forced me to drop the college program because of that fear. I didn't think I had it in me to do it. And again, he took me back after throwing a paper in my face and saying you're going to come back because you're going to stop being scared of success, and because you have a daughter who cares about his father and where he's going to be at in the future, and you need to set that example. So again, giving me a sense of belonging somewhere. I'm a father, I need to, stand up for and actually man up to my responsibilities. And the third time I dropped, again, same issue that I had always had a lot of issues because of my family and the mother of my child. And he didn't bring me back, but then he decided to leave me out of the college program, and basically I had to beg him. I had to beg him to come back into the program. And he allowed me to come back only because I took a whole semester with no credit, and proved to him that I wanted my education, that I had changed, that I no longer, wanted to exert violence in the facility, but wanted to do something positive. So in closing, I just want to say that, a lot of these things that I experienced generally throughout my life were, I had a lot of mental health issues that I had that were undiagnosed or that I didn't pick up on until someone pointed them out to me. But a lot of those issues didn't need to be resolved through medication or through, actually having to be put through a mental health hospital or anything to that extent. It was more or less just having people communicating with me and actually taking the time to talk to me that made it the worthwhile change. The biggest thing, like I said, in terms of just the impact that the system can have on you, is the fact that when I walked out of that train on at Grand Central from upstate and walked out of that train, all the people that came out of that train, literally I stood there frozen because I had never been around so many people for the past 4 years. I've been, like I said, with a group of 15 people for 4 years, and then all of a sudden I get dropped into a train, get out of that train, and it's pandemonium. It was, again, a shock to come out back into society, and realizing that even till now, I'm still going through a lot of issues. There's a lot of stigma that I have to deal with, but through advocacy and through sharing my story, I've been able to overcome that and at the same time help other people. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and